It began as a dream and became a reality. Over 5 decades it has changed, from a small rural church to a suburban church to a church with changing urban demographics. From a congregation begun in a school cafeteria to a 3-building complex with plans to expand even more. But in many ways it has not changed. It remains what it began, a house of the Lord, a mission to the community, a place of worship and fellowship, the body of Christ. For 50 years, St. John's Lutheran Church has served the Franconia area. As we observe that anniversary, let's look back with pride at our history as we commemorate St. John's Lutheran Church, under God's grace, celebrating the past, planning for the future. In 1956, 8 families petitioned the Southeastern District to form a new Lutheran church in the emerging suburb of Springfield, Franconia. Lois and Gordon Stanger were one of those families.
There were 7 families that got together, and we decided that we would like to have a church in our own area so we didn't have to drive 10 miles. We got together with a chaplain who was in our area, Chaplain Teachin, and he was our guiding pastor at that time. We met in his home for several meetings, and then we all went out and did a little canvassing, and we decided we had to have a place to meet. So we went to the different schools, and we went to the one there in Franconia.
They began in the Franconia Elementary School cafeteria, with Chaplain Ottomar Teachin serving as their first pastor, using the original name of Franconia Lutheran Church. 50 years later, St. John's reenacted that first service.
We were very fortunate in getting Chaplain Teachin as our initial first pastor. And as with Pastor Nass, he had the military experience, and we enjoyed having him as our pastor. He was a very guiding light for us.
Earl and Edith Munson and Thelma Shirley remember attending church in that school building, including the ushers hauling the prayer books in and out of the cafeteria each week.
I can remember that bringing those in, it was like a big bookcase on wheels. And we rolled them in, set up the chairs, and took it all back after the service was over.
In the early days, everyone was an evangelist for St. John's.
Certainly St. Mark's was closer to where we lived, and we gave that consideration. But I remember one Sunday afternoon I was working on enclosing my carport, had a visit by Jack Ferson. And the usual conversation is, where are you from, blah, blah, blah. And he happened to mention, or I guess my wife happened to mention, that she was from Boone, Iowa. And he says, Boone? I believe we have Earl Cool from Boone, Iowa. Well, so happens my wife and Earl Cool's sister Lois were just close as old buddies that you could happen to have. And so that sort of made up our minds in a hurry as to where we were going to attend church.
And especially then, strong lay leaders were important.
The president of our congregation, who was Earl Cool, and he was a very aggressive individual in wanting to get the church established. And he was really a front runner in the leadership of the church initially. And I think we owe a lot to him.
We had been there a year, and Pastor Meyer asked my husband if he would head the evangelism for the church, which he did. And he did it for 22 years. Until he passed away. And at that time, when he passed away, we had 24 couples visiting people. And these people wanted to do it. I mean, it was fun to do. We really enjoyed those evangelism calls.
But it was a permanent home that St. John's needed, and so the search began for property to build a church. A site along Franconia Road was chosen, but for an interesting reason. Apparently because Christ Lutheran's pastor liked it.
Pastor Bruning.
Bruning, oh yes. And he liked he liked the all the flowers across the street and one home that was there. And that was very appealing to him. And other than, besides that, why, it seemed that it was a large enough piece of ground for us to construct a building.
So with the land now chosen, in February 1957, final settlement was made for the purchase of 3.5 acres along Franconia Road. And with that, of course, came the church's first capital campaign. The brochure actually shows all 3 buildings we have today. With a permanent church coming, the congregation now needed a full-time pastor. A call was made, and in March of 1957, Pastor Paul Meyer and his wife Catherine accepted the call to come to what was now St. John's Lutheran Church.
Well, I was teaching at Concordia Teachers College in River Forest, which is where I met my wife Kathy, and I received the call. It was a 2-year instructorship, and when that term was up, I needed to go someplace, and St. John's was the one who called me, and I was very happy to accept the call here. I remember the school. It was interesting because the janitor didn't work over the weekends, and one of the first jobs we had when we came was not only setting up chairs for worship, but also scrubbing the floor. And we had some Sunday school classes during the cold part of the year when we couldn't meet outside, actually in some of the closets. So we were a closeted community in a way, and but it was sort of inspirational to work with a group of people so energetic about wanting to form a congregation. The land was already purchased prior to my coming. One of the first things they showed me was a sign that was out on the place where someday the church would be, and of course then we had the joy of seeing the buildings gradually come up and be there.
For the Myers, a newly married couple, the congregation made an extra effort to welcome them.
We moved into this apartment and we didn't have any furniture, so one of the first members, Coralie Geiwitz, was very adept at working with fabric, so she made curtains quickly and helped cover a sofa so that we had some furniture when my husband's folks arrived.
And Pastor Myers says Jack Ferson led some interesting council meetings in those early days when they met in the old parsonage just down the street.
Jack liked to smoke cigars, so he'd bring a 6-pack of Muriel cigars and he'd pass them out to all of the council. We would light up, and so Kathy would know that the meeting was getting late when all the smoke would start rising upstairs into the main floor.
By 1958, a groundbreaking was held for the first church building, with the cornerstone laid just 7 months later. Placed directly next to the 3 crosses that would become a landmark for St. John's for decades to come.
It was exciting to be part of that process. Vosbeck and Ward were our architects. Mr. Vosbeck was the one who worked more directly with us, and was delighted with the first unit we put up. I was also privileged to be here when the congregation worked on the current sanctuary, and to have a place of our own over there instead of coming to the school was a great delight.
Finally, in June of 1959, the new church was dedicated and the first service held. Chuck and Barbara Herbert remember the early days of services in the new building, even though there was no air conditioning, and the temperature had to be controlled by opening and closing the windows.
We had to have the chairs set up, of course, for a worship service, but then we had to break the chairs down and scatter them about for Sunday school. And then later on, when we grew, we had to have a second service, so that meant chairs down, Sunday school, chairs up. It was quite active, and it really was a fun time.
From the beginning, children were in plentiful supply at St. John's. In a preview of the child care center of today, the church had a kindergarten for several years, even before the local schools began offering it.
A lot of children were there.
I remember, though, those metal chairs in our building, and the children would wiggle, and then they would hit the next metal chair. We had a terrible time keeping the children quiet.
It was not until 1960 that women in the church were invited to attend the Voters' Assembly. By 1961, St. John's had grown to over 400 members. And with that growth came the need for a larger sanctuary, which ultimately was dedicated in 1967. After 9 years, Pastor Meyer accepted a call at a church in California. A year later, Pastor Edward Bobb from Omaha became St. John's next pastor. But with the new pastor came perhaps the church's biggest challenge. A new charismatic movement among some members and Pastor Bobb brought great controversy.
We had a charismatic movement in the church that sort of tore the congregation apart between traditional members of the church and a very strong charismatic movement. The pastor, of course, was part of the charismatic movement, and it really divided this church, and membership dropped to the point where our ability to sustain St. John's as a congregation was in jeopardy.
Some of the council as well as the members, frankly, were leaving the church. And so it got to the point where the council realized that they needed to set a new course and a new direction.
Felt that the way and means of progressing in the Lord's kingdom was to search into those aspects of ministry, and we attempted to do so, sometimes with forward progress, sometimes with not so good forward progress. I think it was the right thing to do at the time. I would have gone about certain presentations of the issues a little bit differently.
After a stormy 7.5 years, Pastor Bobb submitted his resignation. The church now needed a new leader to bring it together. In doing so, it turned to a folksy pastor from Hickory, North Carolina, via Richmond, Virginia, to become the new spiritual head of the church. Jim Roseman and his wife Barbara moved to the D.C. area and quickly saw the need to move the congregation beyond its controversy.
And then some of the folks started leaving, and so I spent time with them personally. I asked some of the older members of the parish who had been here and were friends with a lot of these people to visit with them also, because we needed them as much as they needed us. But as time passed, it worked its way out. People did what they were going to do. Some left, some stayed. And then we got to the work of ministry of the parish, and from there on we turned our 100% attention to the growth of ministry in this place where God has placed us.
He'd had experience with a military community, and of course St. John's traditionally has had a fair number of military families, so that was a positive, that we felt that he knew the military community and how to minister to the military community.
Once past the charismatic controversy, Pastor Roseman and the church faced a new challenge: how to grow.
They've asked us to be the Lutheran presence of Kingstown, and so we discussed it and talked about it, and I tried as best I could to help people understand what it meant to grow. And they voted unanimously to do that, so we did it, and so that was a major issue.
As in past years, Pastor Roseman said strong lay leadership was key.
But there was a major desire on their part to do something. And the thing that was very attractive to me as a pastor was their openness. They understood that there was more than Lutherans around, and that the Lutheran Church was not the only expression of the faith. And that was very appealing and attractive to me. And we developed a program called the Mariners, and we had the admiral in charge of everything, and the captains in charge of ships. And the ships are made up of 8, 10, 12 couples. And the ships were centered around things that groups wanted to do: gourmet dining, bridge, theater going, camping. And so it started with a ship that wanted to camp. And the first thing you know, we had 100 people going camping. 150 would go up there, you know, and trailers and motorhomes and tents. And it was just a tremendous experience.
For 18 years, Pastor Roseman brought his humor and his leadership to bear, and the church never looked back.
We had meetings at various homes when Pastor Roseman arrived. And this 90-year-old lady said, "You mean he's a pastor?" And the response was from her, "Well, he certainly doesn't look like a pastor."
But this little table that you see right here, I still have, which was his. It was actually his typing stand, and I tell people that he's the only person that I have ever known whose typing you could not read, because it was unbelievable I don't know how he ever got a secretary to work for him, but he did. It was just amazing.
If he couldn't remember your name, he called you Clyde or something like that, but everybody loved that.
His sermons were always consistent. One might say the same, but let's call them consistent. And he always had 2 points, the grace of God in Jesus Christ and our response to that, namely service to our fellow humans around us. And so that was a constant message from him.
With the church now growing, other things were happening. Women were allowed to serve as president and vice president beginning in 1978. Early communion classes began. And Eileen Bassett was honored in 1981 for 25 years as St. John's organist. More space to do ministry was needed. With St. John's starting a child care center in 1983, the decision was made to build a parish center to house that activity as well as additional classroom space. By 1988, the new parish center was dedicated and open for business. But that year also brought another major change for St. John's: the installation of Jack Meehan as the church's first associate pastor.
My installation date was July 17th, 1988, and it was hotter than blazes. It was just 105 degrees or something. And I also remember the choir processing, and immediately upon getting upstairs, they stripped off their choir robes because it was too hot.
Really, I've just watched him grow into a very, very strong leader as well. Different, he has a different style, but he just, has turned into a wonderful leader for us and always has had that depth of spiritual knowledge and understanding, and he's building that stronger and stronger, into all of us.
He has grown with the congregation. He's seen it through some good times and as well as bad times. And I think he has grown as a person as well as a shepherd and leader of the congregation. And I think he has filled all of those roles. I know they haven't always been easy for him.
In 1995, Pastor Roseman retired. Just 7 months later, that young associate from Iowa became St. John's fourth senior pastor, continuing what would become the longest tenure of any pastor at St. John's.
The first 6 months or so, I think he was kind of looking over his shoulder a lot. So once he got past that and realized that people were looking to him and what he could bring to the church, I think he got over that concern and everything.
That was a challenge, I think, for our people, too, to see me in a new role and a new calling. And that took a while to get into that groove, if you will. But the people here are gracious and understanding and willing to move forward in ministry.
A year later, another chaplain entered St. John's spiritual life. One of our own members, Ben Noss, was installed as the church's newest associate pastor, working together with Pastor Meehan to create a team ministry.
At first there was some concern because basically the associate pastor was going to be older in age than the senior pastor. It's kind of a dichotomy here, but in fact it worked beautifully.
I think there has been in that age difference between Pastor Meehan and myself, a kind of coalescing of younger people toward him and older people toward me, and I think that's natural. So maybe the word exploit is too strong, but we used that to differentiate our ministries just a little bit, and it has certainly, I think, been successful.
He has such a caring and wonderful personality, and he cares very, very deeply about our members and is always keeping up. He's always in tune to who's doing what and what's happening.
With the church growing and the need to do outreach also increasing, plans began to expand the church yet again. But with a landlocked footprint, the only way was to raise the original sanctuary and add a basement level. Then, with financing arranged and with most of the details in place, a new opportunity to grow emerged when Mrs. Posey next door passed away.
And suddenly, last October, our almost 95-year-old neighbor next door, Mrs. Posey, passed away. And that, I guess, wasn't a complete surprise, but it still was rather unexpected. And as a result of that, we were in conversation with Mrs. Posey's daughter, Sonia, and in March of this year, we were able to secure a contract to purchase that 1.8 contiguous acres next door to St. John's.
We were poised through many decisions to sign our name on a loan document for lots and lots of money. We were stepping out in faithfulness. And instead, a few months later, we did sign our name on a line, but it wasn't for the building program. It was to acquire the property next door. And that is where the Lord led us, and I think that is what I'll always remember, is that the Lord tested us and we were faithful, and we learned so much, and I think He's doing that to prepare us for other things.
Yet one more pastoral transition occurred in 2006, with the moving of Pastor Nas to emeritus status and the hiring of Pastor Braun Campbell to be the newest associate pastor. Installed in September, Pastor Campbell hopes he can be a big part of St. John's future.
We don't know exactly where we're going to go yet, and as part of the ongoing activities of the congregation to determine what God's will is for us in this place, I just want to try to be as adaptable as possible.
And so as we mark St. John's 50th anniversary, why has this church been successful for the past half-century?
The people, they're caring, they're well, I don't want to say fellowship, but just knowing that they're family members. If you have a problem personally and you want others to be involved with it, they will certainly be there to help.
They're not afraid to try something. They have an openness. Their understanding of ministry is broad, and that's an example of that. And that's a hallmark of this church.
Their willingness and courage to change. To become set and sedentary in their ways is, I think, a formula for disaster. And even now, while I worked on and certainly cherish the vision statement of our congregation, I can certainly see that that's 10 years old, and it's time to look at it again and say, maybe we need to revamp this and make it something that is expressive and meaningful for the whole congregation.
And what about the future? What do people see in St. John's next 50 years?
Well, I would hope that, I don't know what issues are going to be coming up for the congregation and for the people of God here, but that they would continue to be faithful and would be open to God's leading and be willing to help be the salt and the light as our nation continues to confront different kinds of problems, that they try to be relevant to those.
So I think the church has to be on guard continually to work this openness and to constantly be a part of the community through programming, through ministry, and through doing things that need to be done.
He's calling us to grow in outreach to the community, both evangelism, sharing our faith, as well as our servanthood, sharing and doing things, caring things for the community. And I think that all of that will end up that we grow in numbers.
Young families continuing to change, being able to minister to that change, and certainly I think a change that we're going to see, and this will probably be the biggest challenge, and that is our multi-ethnic ministry.
The face of the landscape around us, and indeed the country at large, is rapidly changing. And the church must recognize that and seek out ways to address the needs of those people who have come to our shores from many other lands.
So 50 years from now, Lord willing, we'll still have the people gathering together in this and maybe birthing more daughter congregations after this.
St. John's has ambitious plans for its future. Expansion of its mission and ministry, expansion of its facilities. But in each case, that work will be guided, as always, by the calling of Jesus to love our neighbors and to serve God here on earth. Who knows what the next 50 years will bring? Few of us will see that day, but rest assured, St. John's will be serving its community and carrying out the work for which all of us are called. St. John's, under God's grace, celebrating the past, planning for the future. I'm Mike Waring. May God bless this church for the next 50 years.